Channel 4 News has gained exclusive access to one of the most closely guarded military secrets of the former Soviet Union. In the shadow of the Ural Mountains is a city sealed off from the outside world, a city that does not officially exist. Until now, it has appeared on no maps. Located between Yekaterinburg, formerly Sverdlovsk, and Chelyabinsk, the city guards the secret of the Soviet Union's status as a superpower, its first and greatest nuclear bomb factory. Our science correspondent Andrew Veitch and a camera team recently returned from the city. In the first of two special reports, he reveals how it concealed for years a series of accidents and a nuclear explosion that add up to a disaster on the scale of Chernobyl.
The edge of Siberia, 900 miles east of Moscow. According to the maps, this road goes nowhere. 2 hours out of Yekaterinburg, the road is blocked. No Western cameras have been allowed here before. Beyond the gates, a city that does not exist. It appears on no maps. It has no name. The city is walled and wired. Until a few years ago, few could pass through the gate. Even relatives were barred from visiting. It is number 65, a district of the nearest administrative centre, Chelyabinsk. This, then, is Chelyabinsk 65. The people call it simply the city. In the December snow, it's a pastel and white sugar icing city. Some of the best buildings were designed by German prisoners of war in 1945. Much of the labour was provided by political prisoners from the gulags of the eastern Urals. They say 80,000 live here, though the city seems bigger. Beyond the walls, over the years, rumours spread of unbounded luxuries. Outsiders called the people of the city the chocolate eaters. And the source of such luxury, the reason for the city's existence, and the secret it guards, for those privileged to pass through the gate, there is nothing to hide. The city was home to Mayak, Stalin's reply to the Manhattan Project, the answer to America's atomic bomb. After Hiroshima, Stalin's police chief Lavrentiy Beria ordered the physicist Igor Kurchatov to gather the best brains in the country to build the Soviet Union's first nuclear warhead. Alexei Spirin was in charge of the first reactor. They built it in 1 year. It started running in 1948.
Да, это было непросто, конечно. Но, понимаете, здесь как раз сыграла наша система, которую мы сейчас развалили и которую раскритиковали, очернили, охаяли. Концентрация усилий. Это была государственная проблема. И государство делало все, чтобы мы могли эту проблему решить в очень сжатые сроки. Было все, что необходимо. Я считаю, это будет потом памятником. И будут вспоминать, как люди после окончания такой страшной войны с такими потерями буквально в считанные годы создали новую отрасль промышленности, невиданную, совершенно принципиально новую.
No Western camera has been allowed inside Mayak. It's the Soviet Union's first and biggest bomb factory. The arms race started here. These people made the Soviet Union a superpower. Theirs was the secret that Gary Powers tried to photograph from his U-2 in 1958 and was shot down. On the iron gates, the numbers 235, uranium-235, the stuff of atomic bombs. The factory switched to producing plutonium for thermonuclear warheads. There are 5 reactors, all now shut down. The last 2, they say, closed this year following the Strategic Arms Agreement. The Russians deny copying the American bomb factory at Hanford in Washington state. The similarities, they say, are superficial. The execution by the Americans of the spies Ethel and Arthur Rosenberg for stealing Hanford's blueprints was, say the Russians, a regrettable mistake. There is one similarity. Mayak and Hanford have left a legacy of pollution. In the early days of the arms race, few cared what happened to the nuclear waste. The Russians now admit that their problems are massively greater than those at Hanford. At Mayak, we found proof of a human and environmental catastrophe. Next to the plant, armoured trucks are loaded with rocks. Mansour Abdulin and his team are dumping them in a lake called Karachai, half a mile from the plant. A ride in these trucks is a ride into a post-nuclear hell. We're taking a load of rocks down to Lake Karachai now. We've just loaded up at the dump. We're in a lead-lined truck. The glass is lead. There's lead all over the roof, down the sides, 5 tons of it and all. Yet with all this shielding, we're told we've got to be down there, we've got to get the rocks off and back in about 12 minutes, because the radiation down here by the lake is so high. Outside the core of a nuclear reactor, this is the most radioactive place on Earth. Beneath the ice, a lethal cocktail of strontium, cesium and plutonium. Until the 50s, nuclear waste was dumped untreated into the water. There are 120 million curies of radiation in this one small lake, 2.5 times the amount released in the Chernobyl disaster. They're filling it in because in 1967, wind blew radioactive sand from the shore across miles of woods, fields and villages. The driver's overalls are no protection against radiation. The convoy of trucks is dumping millions of tons of rubble around piers made of concrete blocks. The time limit at the edge of the lake is 3 minutes. And I hope the engine doesn't break down. Just having a little difficulty getting into gear here, but I'm sure it'll work. We monitored the radiation level in one truck. It was equal to the maximum safety limit for a British nuclear worker. We were unable to check the crack in Mansour Abdulin's windscreen. A year before Gary Powers tried to photograph Mayak, there was another disaster. Until recently, it too was a state secret. Now the Russians confirm it was the world's worst nuclear accident until Chernobyl. The radiation count rises as we near the site of the disaster. Waste from the reactors was stored underground. These are the ventilation pipes. Control systems failed. The waste dried, leaving an explosive mixture. At 4:20 on the afternoon of September the 12th, 1957, tank number 14 exploded with the power of a kiloton bomb. Inside, 80 tons of nuclear waste from the plutonium plant. This is the spot where the explosion happened 34 years ago. The tank was buried underground here. The explosion was so enormous it ripped the top off the tank, the concrete and steel top, and a radioactive plume rose thousands of feet into the air. 20 million curies of radiation escaped, just under half that released at Chernobyl. The shattered lid is still intensely radioactive. 18 million curies landed on Mayak itself, contaminating roads and laboratories. 2 million curies rose in a plume a kilometre high and were blown across the countryside. The cloud was visible for miles around. Ivan Tepliakov was working as a student in a village nearby.
Приехал сюда на велосипеде. Значит, был мощный взрыв, сильный взрыв. Значит, он не похож был на другие. Значит, была даже какая-то ударная волна, значит, задребезжали, стекла. Значит, через минут примерно 30, значит, может даже чуть побольше, появилось облако, примерно вот в этом направлении. Сделало след наподобие сигарообразной формы, но немножко искривленной.
The prevailing wind blew the cloud away from Chelyabinsk 65, the cities of Chelyabinsk, Kishtim, Ekaterinburg and Kamensk-Uralsky, but it contaminated a swathe of land more than 300 kilometers long and 50 wide, 20,000 square kilometers or 8,000 square miles in all. Radiation levels reached 4,000 curies in the worst area. Today it's down to 500 curies. A hint, perhaps, of a nuclear winter. These fields were covered with strontium-90, cesium-137 and a cocktail of other isotopes. 10,700 people were evacuated. 23 villages were bulldozed into the ground. 9,000 tons of food were destroyed. Thousands of animals were slaughtered and buried. Only now, after the topsoil has been stripped away, are the fields becoming fertile once more. Nearer the centre of the tract, keep-out signs. The radiation area is still a forbidden zone. The snow acts as a shield against the worst of the beta rays in the soil. 100 curies per square kilometre. The sign warns against eating mushrooms because they soak up radiation. Approaching the centre of the zone, the level rises sharply. We're at the centre of the forbidden zone, and beneath the snow, the ground is highly radioactive. The explosion happened about 12 miles to the west. The plume rose thousands of feet into the air, and much of the fallout landed here. The sign says 500 curies per square kilometre. That's far higher than the worst hotspots found in Britain after the Chernobyl disaster. The radiation level in this lake is 10,000 times higher than it was before the explosion. This wasteland was once Aliek Niga Matulin's village. Hours after the explosion, he says, men in white coats arrived and told them they had 24 hours to leave. They could take nothing but their documents and the clothes they were wearing.
А утром, когда загудели, эти машины подъехали, тут сразу, как залпом, слезы, все плакают. Не желаю никому. Такие дела было.
Some of the villagers suffered doses as high as 100 rems, enough to cause radiation sickness. The authorities insist no one died as a result of the explosion. But the Russians now confirm that the worst disaster was caused by deliberately dumping waste from Mayak into the river Techa. In the early years of the arms race, 7.5 million curies of untreated nuclear waste were dumped here. They thought it would be washed out into the Arctic Ocean. Instead, it stuck in the silt. Slowly, it oozed downstream and polluted the villages on the riverbanks. 20 villages have been eliminated. One town remains, Muslumova. 50 kilometres downstream from Mayak, the remnants of a fence on the frozen banks of the Tetra. There are no warning signs. The children of Muslumova are playing on the ice. When we tested the banks, we found beta and gamma radiation from strontium-90 and cesium-137. It was 8 times higher than normal, more than enough to endanger children. These children told us they swim here in the summer. The authorities have confirmed 935 cases of chronic radiation sickness among those living on the banks of the river, an increase of at least 40% in cases of leukemia, and a rise in the number of babies dying. More people are complaining of pains in joints. Doctors say this could be caused by drinking water contaminated with strontium-90. The hospital in Chelyabinsk, which is caring for the people of the Tetra, is short of beds and drugs.
Но когда мы смотрим всех облучившихся людей в верхнем течении реки Течи, получивших большие дозы, то оказывается, что у них в 2 раза чаще заболеваемость лейкемией, чем у необлучившегося населения. Примерно в 2 раза чаще была смертность от врожденных уродств у тех детей, которые облучились инутеро.
На голове шишек, полная голова шишки. И еще есть и шишки. Мы у реки жили, и там мы брали воду, рыбу ели. Никто нам ничего не говорил.
Until recently, doctors were forbidden from using the word radiation in their diagnoses. Mayak's director now says he regrets the years of secrecy.
И другие вещи. Мы сегодня открыто говорим о той экологической обстановке, которая сложилась за 42 года деятельности оборонного предприятия. зеленых, общественности является тот аргумент, что ну вот вы нас 42 года обманывали, а сейчас мы вам, естественно, не верим. И в этой ситуации работать не очень просто.
On the banks of the Tetra, a new generation may already be paying the price of the arms race. The price to the new Russia of cleaning up the nuclear fallout from its bomb factory is put at £40 billion. In opening the gates of the secret city, the Russians are seeking cooperation from those that Mayak was created to destroy. Andrew Veitch, ITN, Mayak.
Tonight's headlines: Sterling.
London, the worsening plight of the forgotten victims of the Gulf War. Channel 4 News has discovered that thousands of tons of nuclear waste, including spent fuel from reactors and weapons-grade plutonium, have been secretly dumped in the Russian Arctic Sea for more than 20 years. Confidential documents revealing the extent of the dumping have been uncovered by a Russian nuclear expert. Some reports say soldiers even shot holes in radioactive containers to make them sink. The waste comes from nuclear submarines in Russia's Northern Fleet and nuclear-powered icebreakers in the port of Murmansk, home to the world's greatest concentration of nuclear installations. The build-up of waste there and in the dumping grounds in the Arctic island of Novaya Zemlya is seen as a threat to the whole of Europe. From Murmansk, our science correspondent Andrew Veitch sends this special report on what many fear is a nuclear time bomb primed to explode.
Late winter at the tip of Arctic Russia, almost 1,000 miles north of Moscow. The Horse's Head of the Kola Peninsula looks towards the nuclear test ground of Novaya Zemlya, another 700 miles to the northeast. President Yeltsin has banned further bomb tests, but the barren island and much of the seas around it are still sealed areas, policed by the Russian Navy. The 600 ships of the Northern Fleet are based in the ice-free port of Murmansk and the closed city of Severomorsk a few miles from here. Their presence has ensured that the nuclear burial grounds around Novaya Zemlya have remained secret. The former Soviet Union has told the International Atomic Energy Agency, which polices these matters, that no nuclear material had been dumped at sea. Confidential documents found by Russian researchers show that much of it came from the fleet's nuclear-powered submarines. 39 are based here at Severomorsk, armed with ballistic missiles and nuclear torpedoes. The rest came from nuclear-powered icebreakers. 7 are moored here at the Atomflot base in the suburbs of Murmansk. The Siberia is about to set sail out into the White Sea. Her 2 reactors are running at full power. Each holds 200 kilos of uranium. The fuel has to be taken out and replaced every 3 years. The spent fuel contains plutonium, generated by the nuclear reactions in the core. Added to the military power plants, there are an estimated 300 reactors in the Murmansk region, almost certainly the greatest concentration of nuclear installations on Earth. Much of the nuclear waste from the icebreakers is packed into ships moored alongside. Spent fuel is stored on the Imandra. This is the hot heart of Imandra. In the tubes behind this window, 800 kilos of used nuclear fuel from the icebreakers. And because of the nuclear processes that have gone on in the reactors, it's now laced with weapons-grade uranium and plutonium. This fuel stays here for 3 years to cool and is then taken by rail across Russia to the former bomb factory at Chelyabinsk 65 in the Urals. The city's civilian authorities say these floating nuclear stores are vulnerable to accidents and to terrorists, but as yet they have nowhere on land to keep the fuel. Andrei Zolotkov is a nuclear engineer on the Imandra and a people's deputy of the former Soviet Union. The KGB let him see documents detailing clandestine dumping operations.
Все документы, с которыми я знакомился, они хранятся на одном из судов и сегодня. На Лепсе хранятся все отчеты. В Комитете госбезопасности ни с какими документами не знакомился. Но контакты определенные мне приходилось иметь с ними. хотя бы для того, чтобы подойти к этим документам. В период с 1964 года по 1986 год, это 22 года, и те документы, с которыми я знакомился, то есть это ограниченный период, было затоплено порядка 17 тысяч контейнеров.
This chart of the dumping sites off Novaya Zemlya was drawn up by a Russian journalist with Zolotkov's help. There are 10 major dumping grounds, all in the Kara Sea to the east of the island. Submarines with nuclear fuel still aboard were sunk in the Stepopov Gulf and Abrosimov Gulf. Nuclear bombs were tested on the west and south of the island. According to Russian sources, sailors were ordered to shoot holes in containers of radioactive waste until they sank. 2 sets of reactors from the Lenin were also dumped in the Kara Sea. One contained nuclear fuel. Zolotkov has pinpointed the dump sites.
И, по всей видимости, в течение какого-то времени и металл, который защищает это топливо, и химические компоненты, они могут разрушиться в морской среде. И тогда вода подойдет к самому топливу. И начнется вымыв вот этой вот топливной композиции, которая содержит в основном все радиоактивные вещества, накопленные в реакторе. Это достаточно опасная вещь.
Joshua Handler of Greenpeace has been assessing the threat of contamination.
We have the classic case of a ticking time bomb here. We just don't know what's going to happen. All we do know is many of the radionucleotides have half-lives much longer than the steel surrounding them. So at some point, unless these things are raised, leakage is going to occur. And at that point, we begin to get concerned that it enters the food chain, and also the damage it'll do directly to the marine environment. But for all we know, leakage has already occurred.
600,000 people live in Murmansk. They are growing increasingly worried about the nuclear storehouses on their doorstep. In December, the city executive found that without warning, the Navy had begun the highly dangerous operation of taking fuel and reactors out of 3 of its oldest submarines. The governor ordered the Navy to stop the operation until safety procedures had been checked. The Navy has to decommission 30 old submarines over the next 3 years. The risk is that the reactors will run out of control when the lids are lifted off. A similar operation at the Navy's Vladivostok base 7 years ago ended in disaster. 10 men are known to have died.
What had happened is they'd put the reactor top on top of the reactor, and they'd put it down slightly off, so they had to relift it. And as they lifted it, it went slightly askew. And as they picked it up, the control rods that were attached to the top of the reactor obviously were withdrawn, and a criticality resulted. It's unclear what happened next, but either the fuel vaporized or the water around the fuel vaporized, and an explosion resulted.
Более чем 30 лет эксплуатации атомной энергетики, у нас это все было закрыто. У нас даже мы, атомщики, не знали о аварийных ситуациях хотя бы для своего опыта дальнейшего.
15 miles from the city, the region's dump for medium-level nuclear waste is guarded by one man and his dog. The signs urge drivers to take care of their radioactive cargo. Buried behind the wire are 3,000 curies of radiation. Beneath the lid, radioactive sources from hospitals, factories and laboratories, much of it cobalt and cesium, 250 cubic meters in all. Safety regulations here are less stringent than those in the West. The dump is more than half full. The man in charge of nuclear safety in Murmansk recognizes it's far from satisfactory. The waste will have to be moved to a safer site.
Ну вот, допустим, видите, вот сейчас здесь образовался иней. Весной что, он растает, начинается коррозия. То есть длительно вот так хранить или вечно так хранить источники нельзя.
More waste is stored at Atomplot's headquarters in the docks. They incinerate 20 tons of contaminated clothes, rags and plastics every year. Radiation from the rags in this skip measures 30 microsieverts an hour, more than the safety limit for workers in the UK. This lid shields another massive store of nuclear waste. much of it highly contaminated tar. To prove that the lid was an effective barrier, the chief of safety, Vladimir Shevnin, told his men to lift it off and to remove the shield underneath.
No, it's measuring. It's going up to 1,000 now. That's very dangerous. Well, I'm close enough.
The effect this is having on the men who work here is unclear. High doses of radiation do cause leukemia, and damage to the father's sperm may trigger leukemia among their children. But reports of 120 cases of childhood leukemia in Murmansk last year are denied by the authorities. The city's radiological laboratory monitors air, water and food, but they have found no evidence of contamination. The director, Tatiana Dubovaya, is more concerned about an accident at Atomflot. She estimates that a radioactive cloud from the plant would cover 65,000 people. 25,000 would be seriously injured. Her emergency plan assumes medical facilities would be available to treat the victims. But in the leukemia ward at Murmansk Cancer Hospital, doctors told us they were desperately short of the most basic drugs. Concern has now spread far beyond the city. Norway is worried about the immediate threat to fish from the dumping in the Kara Sea. Fears over the safety and security of the waste have prompted the European community to offer help in building a permanent store. The favoured site is Novaya Zemlya. Because, as the Chernobyl disaster showed, Russia's nuclear legacy is a potential threat to the whole of Europe. Andrew Veitch, ITN, Murmansk.
After the break, the Next week in Berlin, the world's nations are meant to take the next step to avert the threat of global warming. But a decision to start cutting the emission of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide is likely to founder. Yet the need for tougher action is becoming clearer. Since they signed the climate convention in Rio de Janeiro 2 years ago, the evidence that the climate is changing has hardened. Scientists say the poles will be affected first. Our science correspondent Andrew Veitch has been to Spitsbergen inside the Arctic Circle, where scientists are already finding that melting ice could bring unexpected changes to Britain's weather.
This is frontier science. Stig Onerheim packs a pistol with his computer.
Oh, you see the seat? They're eating up the seat. You see the rest of the seat.
Marauding polar bears are part of life when you're working on a glacier 5 hours by snowmobile from the nearest town.
It was a mother with one child. He's hungry.
Stig checks whether the bears are still near the hut. It's a warm night on Spitsbergen. Normally it's around 30 below zero in March. Tonight it's a mere 10 below, almost like spring. And the bears love it. Next morning, one of our bears came back. He was not yet full grown, and he seemed more curious than hungry. 4 or 5 of them had been hunting seals, waiting for them to surface through breathing holes in the ice a mile away. The scientist in charge of the expedition, Rune Ødegaard, was ready to shoot. If the bear attacked, he'd have one chance to kill it. But judging from the state of the bear's backside, this one had taken an early breakfast. Rune and Stig are based at the Norwegian Polar Institute on Spitsbergen. They're working with British scientists on a project sponsored by the European Commission to monitor glaciers. Computer models show that when the greenhouse effect takes hold, it will be felt first at the poles. Snowfall will increase as the climate warms, but the ice will melt. Spitsbergen, at the northern extremity of the Gulf Stream, is the most sensitive site. 2 years ago at the Earth Summit, Developed nations promise to stabilise emissions of the main greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, but most are failing to meet that target. Britain, Germany and Russia say they'll succeed. In the United States, Japan and elsewhere, emissions of carbon dioxide are still rising. Reindeer have seldom been seen feeding in this area in March. The lichen is normally frozen. This week, scientists reported that plants were spreading on Spitsbergen and that melting sea ice had exposed a new island. In the Antarctic, a whole ice shelf is disintegrating. Runer's measurements show the glaciers on Spitsbergen are shrinking. Every year on this river of ice, Finster-Valdebreen, more melts than is replaced by snowfall.
There was a change in the climate just after the turn of the century. And the Spitsbergen glacier started to retreat around 1920. And ever since there has been a retreat of about 1 feet every year. So that makes more than 30 meters.
He placed his monitoring equipment on the surface of the glacier last year. Now it's buried a meter deep.
We drilled a borehole to the bed of the glacier here. The depth of the glacier is about 200 meters. And in the borehole we put temperature sensors. There are measurements all over the world on mountain glaciers and Arctic glaciers, and the results from Spitsbergen is actually very close to what you see all over.
Across the island, the same is happening. Temple Fjord ends in a crumbling cliff of blue ice. Frozen at its foot, the remnants of last summer's melt. This wall of ice behind me is the edge of the Von Post Glacier. In the summer, a few months from now, a bit of it will break away and masses of fresh water will flood into the fjord. The computer models predict that if much more of these glaciers melt, the influx of cold, fresh water will destabilise the ocean's circulation, and that could switch off the current that keeps Britain warm. Spitsbergen is on the edge of the Arctic ice cap. If the sea ice retreats, the effect could be dramatic. The Gulf Stream keeps Britain relatively warm. In the North Atlantic, it cools and sinks. Cold water flows south of Africa to rise up again in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, returning as warm surface currents in a huge 1,000-year moving loop called the conveyor. But global warming might halt the conveyor. As the ice melts, as global temperatures rise, fresher water might flood into the Atlantic, weakening the Gulf Stream and forcing it south, perhaps stopping it altogether. If that happens, Britain and Northern Europe might suffer colder winters because of global warming. The head of the British team monitoring the glaciers is certain that whatever the effects, Spitsbergen has got warmer.
We can see that there's quite an abrupt climate warming of up to about 5 degrees centigrade from about 1910, 1915 onwards, and that warming has continued up to the present. If one takes a simple doubling of CO2, it appears that most of the linked glacier climate models suggest that there will be continuing melting of the smaller ice caps in the Arctic.
Sea ice is very fresh. It contains very little salt, and so when the sea ice melts, as it does as the global warming proceeds in the model simulation, it puts fresh water out onto the surface of the ocean. That has the effect of slowing down the conveyor. The effect of that may well in the future be to change, for example, the direction of the Gulf Stream.
The palm trees of Portmeirion in West Wales would flourish in the warmer greenhouse summers. But if the Gulf Stream goes, they might die in the colder winters. How long it will take for the ocean conveyor to collapse, for weather patterns to change, no one knows. It could happen suddenly, or it could take a century. But few doubt its severity.
It could be very serious, not only for the climate of the British Isles, but also for the climate of the globe generally. The ocean circulation plays a very important part in maintaining our climate, and therefore anything which affects the conveyor belt circulation, I think we should be extremely concerned about.
The latest computer models at the Hadley Centre show the poles, then the rest of the globe, turning pink through the 21st century as the planet heats up. The scientists are certain that global warming is happening. The only question is which parts of the planet will heat most and when.
We're dealing with a long-term problem. Which we're dealing with something which is 10, 20, 30, 50 years, over which we have to act. We have to start to act now because the infrastructure that we build, the power stations, our energy sources, are all built, of course, for that sort of period of time. So we need to act now and begin to do that.
If the ice caps do melt, sea levels will rise around the world, swamping low-lying countries. Scientists working for environmental groups say greenhouse gas emissions will have to be cut by 20% in the first decade of the next century if this is to be avoided. Yet the Environment Secretary John Gummer will next week propose a cut of only 5 to 10%, and that provided other nations at the Berlin meeting agree.
That lead which John Gummer has made is very good indeed, because it's really a big psychological change in attitude from allowing things to increase to really starting to make them decrease. And I think that may have quite a big effect in Berlin.
If he's wrong, the polar bears of Spitsbergen could soon be hunting on very thin ice. Senior officials say the most likely outcome of next week's conference is that nations will agree only to negotiate limits on carbon emissions 2 years from now. Whatever the threat from the melting ice caps, cuts seem out of the question. Andrew Veitch, Channel 4 News on Spitsbergen.
And tonight's headlines from French military staff. What concerns environmentalists is the possibility of massive contamination if Mururoa Atoll breaks up under the force of a French nuclear explosion. This has already happened in the former Soviet Union, according to secret documents seen by Channel 4 News. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Russia tested 128 nuclear devices underground. 2, which exploded in Yakutia in northeastern Russia, ended in disaster. Both were near the diamond mining town of Udashne. There, our science correspondent Andrew Veitch, the first Western television journalist to visit the area, found startling evidence of widespread nuclear contamination.
Perhaps they thought the evidence would lie hidden forever in the waste of Siberia. Perhaps they didn't care. But in the midsummer sun, the banks of the river Lena are as hot as the French Riviera, and the evidence has been laid bare. When the doctors first went to the village of Malachi, they found nearly 2/3 of the children were suffering from enlarged thyroid glands. 2 were taken straight to hospital for cancer treatment. The cause yet to be confirmed, as at Chernobyl, radioactive iodine. The children could not be protected because the nuclear explosion and the disaster it caused were secrets of the state.
It's dangerous because nobody knows what real result of these explosions, because it was secret, it's absolutely secret 20 years ago or 17 years ago when it was conducted. But now we have evidence that the cloud of radioactivity going from Kraton for several hundred kilometers. Nobody was informed about this.
Upstream from Malachi on the river Maha, the army flew here in 1978 to help geologists make a seismic survey. An explosion deep underground, so immense that it would make the rock ring. The dead trees show the track of the radioactive plume that escaped when the explosion burst through the permafrost. Dr. Brian East is acting as our consultant. This is the first time a Western scientist has seen these bomb sites. The Russian nuclear expert working with us, Alexander Segonov, has warned there are hot spots. Plutonium is lying on the ground. 1 speck, if inhaled, can be fatal. The post marks ground zero. The project was codenamed Kraton 3. 1,800 feet below this point, they detonated a thermonuclear device almost as powerful as the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The sign gives no warning of radioactivity. It says simply no drilling.
That's Peters and Gammas. It's about double coming close up from about 20 yards away.
Even though the contaminated soil around the site has been bulldozed, there are still traces of strontium and cesium. Elk drink in this pond. Their droppings are radioactive. But this area is clear of plutonium.
I don't think we need to take all these precautions with masks. I'm just going to take mine off. Oh, well, that'll do, I think. Let me breathe a bit. Good. Keep the hat on for the mosquitoes. The great deal.
The worst of the plutonium hotspots, says Alexander, is a kilometre away in the dead forest. He says the military abandoned the site after the disaster and only returned 2 years later, when the worst of the radioactivity had died away.
И работали, видно даже сейчас, что работали очень наспех, да, торопились, боялись, быстро. И уходили в сторону. Там все с себя сбрасывали, бросали так одежду. Вот обваловка сделана, вот эта примитивная такая, вал. Вот этот. И это ненадежно совершенно. От такой воды со склонов, я как геолог-то, я бы защищался канавой наоборот.
The thin covering of uncontaminated soil is being washed away. This mound that I'm standing on is covering 2,500 tons of machinery contaminated by the explosion. Radiation levels here on top of the soil are pretty low, but dig down and they rise rapidly. The scientists say that a stream flowing through the test site is carrying radioactive particles into the river. Once in the river, they'll be washed slowly downstream towards Malachi, the diamond town of Mirny, and on into the Lena. Maps at the Nuclear Safety Agency in Yakutsk show the true extent of contamination at Kraton 3.
Это плутоний здесь. Это плутонием. Потому что плутоний не фигурировал ни в каких отчетах и информациях. И уже мы его обнаружили, что там еще есть плутоний, и это было немножко неожиданно. И отсюда, конечно, проблема сразу. И запыленность, и... Единственная боязнь, вот этот сухой лес, ягель, если в случае пожара, то это может распространяться на большие расстояния.
The second disaster is, if anything, more dangerous. A bomb site little over a mile from the diamond town of Udachne.
И прямо там вот эта зияющая, вот такая открытая, как рана, воронка, которая, пусть она там и 200 микрорентген всего невысокая активность, но оказалась насыщена вот плутонием. Вот первая проблема, которая перед нами встала. Вторая проблема оказалась, это все попытаться ликвидировать, даже хотя бы своими силами, засыпать. Но оказалось, что нужны обязательные вот аппаратурные, и любые, без ученых и без аналитики нельзя сделать это качественно. И боязнь вмешательства наше не навредило бы больше.
The epicenter of Project Kristall has been buried beneath a sarcophagus. It was a small thermonuclear bomb, 1.7 kilotons, but it was detonated only 300 feet beneath the surface. They planned to make a water reservoir for the diamond mine. The device backfired. When they returned to the site after the worst of the radioactivity had faded, they found a crater filled with water and hurled out by the blast the concrete and steel plug which should have sealed the bomb. The sarcophagus is only 10 minutes' drive out of town. The sign warns of radiation, but there are no fences. The government of Yakutia has asked Moscow for 14 billion rubles to clean up the bomb sites. They've been told there is no money. You have lived with it so far, you can live with it a little longer. This forest is alive with insects, but it's also, in effect, a nuclear waste dump. The earth beneath the sarcophagus is soaked in plutonium to a depth of 300 feet. The plume from the explosion rose, then fell here and to the west, killing acres of trees. Radioactive cesium is recycling in the moss. The children come here to pick berries and mushrooms.
People come in here and gather the stuff and eat it. And there is radioactivity in the ground, and there is a possibility that can be taken up by the fruit or the fungi, and maybe even concentrated to some extent, And that's a direct pathway when they eat the food. Direct pathway into the people.
20,000 work in the diamond mines at Udachne on the edge of the Arctic Circle. Most come for the high wages, then leave. Only recently have families begun to settle here. That makes it difficult to keep health records. But doctors say that cases of thyroid cancer throughout Yakutia have quadrupled over the last 6 years, from around 8 to 33 last year. Vasily Alexeyev obtained confidential state documents describing the nuclear disasters when he became a parliamentary deputy for Yakutia. He asked scientists from the Nuclear Research Institute at St. Petersburg to investigate the extent of the contamination.
Я не буду предсказывать всю эту информацию громадную, но скажу, что по уровню плутоний-239 и 240 почве, вот эта местность Кротон-3 почти на 100 раз превосходит аналогичные вот эти участки в 30-километровой зоне Чернобыльской АЭС. Этим все сказано. Ну, период, вы знаете, период полураспада плутоний-239 это 24 тысячи лет. Вы можете представить, сколько нам еще, якутянам, надо ждать, чтобы ситуация стабилизировалась и не представляли опасность.
Professor Yavlikov, who has mapped peaceful nuclear explosions in the rest of the former Soviet Union, he's identified 128 in all, echoes the point and adds a warning.
It's a nuclear bomb underground. It gives us enormous amount of radiation. The same as a typical nuclear testing, the same, absolutely same. It's not true that nuclear testing can be safe underground. Never, because each nuclear testing gives us enormous amount of gas products which seeping into atmosphere.
Whatever the initial effect of the explosions, the people of Yakutia have been left with thousands of tons of earth and machinery contaminated with plutonium, buried next to the source of their water supply. The dumps will remain intensely radioactive for 24,000 years. If the worst has already happened, the first cases of leukemia should be appearing now. It's too late to prevent them. As one nuclear expert here told us, the only protection against radiation is knowledge. The people were denied that knowledge.
Andrew Veitch reporting on the massive contamination caused by underground nuclear tests in Russia. Now look again at tonight.